Should be okay now.
Hello. We're going to start our program. I want to welcome you all here. Can you hear? Now you can hear? Okay, good. Please let us know because we can't tell. I want to welcome you. You're going to be meeting a very, very special person and about a subject that is very, very important. I'm introducing Dr. Yvonne Chiu. She's a professor at the U.S. Naval War College. She writes on war theory and international affairs. She has been a national fellow at the Hoover Institute, a member of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, and that one is a hot one, and a professor of the University of Hong Kong. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Chiu as she presents Betwixt and Between Taiwan and the Shadow of China. This is really important. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. If you can't hear me, let me know. You can. Okay. Great. So I'm going to talk today about, so Dale asked me to come and talk about China and US relations. I am going to, actually before I begin, I need to give the standard disclaimer. Everything I say today is my personal thoughts and opinions. I do not represent the Naval War College or Department of Navy or Department of Defense or the federal government. So they're not accountable for anything that I say. I'm going to talk about why we should consider China to be what we call the pacing threat. And then I will talk about why I think Taiwan is the linchpin in US-China relations. And then I'll talk a little bit about economic embeddedness and the global order. So hopefully we can get through all of this in a half hour. So in the immediate post-Cold War era, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were no effective constraints on US power, but things are different now, right? The US is now constrained. It has to figure out how to operate in a world with other major powers, and China presents the biggest geopolitical challenge on this front. So why do we think China is what we call the pacing threat? The first is population. So this is the global population. Hold on, let me see, there you go. As you can see, Asia has about almost 60% of the world's population. Africa is the next biggest group with 17.5. North America, we're less than 5%. Europe is less than 10%. So, in terms of distribution of population, which is necessary for labor force, Asia has a major advantage. Now, China specifically has 1.1, sorry, but everything's really hard to read, 1.45 billion. So it has the largest share of the population right now, but they're facing a demographic crisis. They're starting to see the long-term effects of the one-child policy. So even though they've still pipped India at this point, probably in another 30 years, right? India will have surpassed China demographically. It's really unclear what's going to happen in China as a result of that demographic crisis. A lot of reforms are going to have to be made. We don't know if they're going to make them. So that's a concern. But another reason people think about China as a pacing threat is its share of the global GDP. So this is from 1970 to 2019. And actually, 2019 is a good year to stop because this is right before COVID. I feel like the COVID years, we all get a mulligan for that. We're not sure what's going to happen afterwards. But up till 2019, you can see that this is Asia right here. So this is Asia's share they have the largest share of the GDP. Asia's been the biggest share gainer over the last 50 years as well. So China specifically has, in the year 2022, had the largest share of global GDP at about 18%. The EU and the US have about 15% apiece. But what's important to know is that China's population at 1.4 billion is 3 times the EU population, which is just under 450,000, and 4 times the United States population. Sorry, did I say 1,000? 450 million. And the US population, which is about 330 million. So per capita, even though China has the greatest global share of the GDP, per capita, they still have a long way to go. All right. So this is a map of all the shipping routes in the world. And the reason I put this up here is because another reason we worry about China as the pacing threat is because it is engaging in a very strategic protection of its commercial interests. So the global system generally operates according to freedom of navigation. This enables for there to be free, widespread global trade, and this is something that the US has led and helps to protect. So what China is doing, though, is they're trying to develop broad regional assets. They're trying to develop infrastructure and capabilities to secure certain vital trade routes through the East and South China Sea. So this is a map of all the trade routes. This is a map of the trade routes by density. All right, and so you can see where the major routes are. So between US on both sides, along here, and around there. So so in the course of developing their near sea defenses, China is able to protect their commercial interests, and they're able to reduce their vulnerability to US control of the seas. And you can see the geography in Asia is extremely challenging. There are lots of choke points around in the Asia region. So this is a map of the One Belt, One Road plan from 2016. This was an infrastructure development strategy. And it includes port facilities all along here, rail networks over land. Okay, so rail networks over land, and diplomatic relationships, also various commercial relationships. So one of the purposes of this, of the overland stuff is that, for example, it can bypass some of these naval choke points. So, for example, they would like to build a railway from Kunming across into Burma, and that would allow them to bypass this choke point down here, which is the Strait of Malacca. All right. So they're doing it in a lot of ways, but the key is that transport by sea requires a lot more capital investment, but it is ultimately more effective in the long run. So they don't want to rely entirely on these overland routes, which you can see are quite circuitous. So they're developing their near seas defenses. They're building artificial islands in the South China Sea, and militarizing them, and claiming international waters as their own. And you may or may not have heard of all the stuff that's going on in South China Sea. There's lots of, the Chinese are very aggressive with other countries' fishing vessels. They will ram them, they will board them, seize them, basically this is all part of claiming these territorial waters as their own. So this is there's also a much larger strategy, which we call a port denial strategy. So what China would like is, it is not yet a major maritime power. It does have a couple aircraft carriers, it does have some blue water capabilities, but still has a long way to go to be a major naval power. And what it wants to do is set up logistics and authorities for port access so that they can turn those into forward operating bases. So this here is a map of every ocean port outside of China with at least a partial Chinese port owner or operator as of spring 2022. And you can see they are all over the place. So they own or operate 96 ports in 53 countries outside of China. And these international port terminals that the Chinese firms own or operate, they already provide dual-use capabilities for the PLA, this is the People's Liberation Army, during peacetime. It helps establish intelligence networks and logistics networks that can help China project power into critical regions worldwide. So the question for us is, how effective would, because these are all commercial ports, right? How effective would those commercial ports be for China in wartime? And it varies. So the ports differ a lot in terms of geography, in terms of the amount of operational control that these Chinese firms have, and also the physical capability to support PLAN surface vessels. So you need, for example, you need harbors of a certain depth, right, for certain types of ships, and not all of these ports have that. So, so it's mixed in terms of how effective it will be. As commercial facilities in non-allied states, right, the PLAN is not going to be able to convert all of them to military use in wartime. So we're looking at 96 ports. They're not going to be able to use all of them, but they will be able to convert some of them. Right. And so as a result, and it's the other reason we consider China to be a pacing threat is its broader military capacity. So China is developing far seas defense. This slide shows you, I pulled this from an article that was actually about American power, and it compared, the reason they chose 1986 and 2022 is because those are the 2 years of the Top Gun movies. And what you can see is that in 2022, China already has more ships. Now, the US has more missiles, and the US has more robust launch systems. And the question is, should we be concerned that our fleet is shrinking? And intentionally, the US is intentionally shrinking its fleet. So the US, I think, assumes that high-tech weaponry is going to win the day. But there are a lot of questions about that. One, we've seen, even in our recent history, in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, that it is very easy for a lot of low-tech weaponry to defeat high-tech systems very efficiently, and we don't have a good answer for that. Also, there's a recent study that looks historically at competition between naval powers, and this study, we can question the methodology, but the study finds that the bigger fleets win, right? Even if they are less technologically advanced. So when it comes to navies, maybe size does matter. And there are all sorts of reasons for that, and that's because naval warfare is it's very different from land warfare, right? It is defensive in nature, and so that takes a different type of strategy, different type of approach. So all of these reasons, the population, the share of the GDP, their broader economic and infrastructure plans, and also the size of the Navy, these are all reasons we consider China to be the pacing threat. But I think the fundamental reason that China is the pacing threat is because it has a greater capacity to shape the global order. And that makes it the biggest strategic challenge. So what do I mean when I say capacity to shape the global order? Our status quo is, in the post-World War II, is that we have a rules-based liberal global order, and that includes freedom of navigation, free trade over the seas. And the US and liberal democracies dominate this global order, and they police this global order. And this is something that the US says it takes seriously. So in 2020, the State Department issued this extensive report called The Elements of the China Challenge. And it said, this was number 3 on their list of things to do. United States must fortify the free, open, and rules-based international order that it led in creating after World War II, which is composed of sovereign nation states and based on respect for human rights and fidelity to the rule of law. Now, it's easy to take this rules-based international order for granted, but it is not natural in any sense of the word. This is something that takes a lot of effort and blood to develop and to maintain, and people and countries have to enforce those rules in order for this to survive. And I think we're seeing this very much in Ukraine, right? We pay a heavy cost when the liberal global order is challenged, and liberal democracies apparently needed that reminder. So, Taiwan. this is the second part. So why is Taiwan the key issue in the US-China relationship? One question that people often ask is, why not just let China have Taiwan, right? What's the big deal? It would solve all the problems of Chinese aggression in Asia, and we'd still be fine. But there are a couple concerns. One is, when in history has a great power, after getting what it's wanted, actually stopped while it was ahead? The answer is never. And I think we will find that if the international community lets China take Taiwan, there will be no peace afterwards. And part of the reason is the impact on Japan and US interests here. So this is a map of, in 1950, what Dean Acheson called the perimeter defense approach. So Dean Acheson drew this line across Asia and basically said, okay, everything to the right of this, we will protect, so Japan and the Philippines, but everything to the left is in China's sphere of influence. And that includes Korea and Taiwan. So this perimeter defense theory lasted a few short months, and then the North Koreans and the Chinese invaded South Korea, and they scrapped this entire thing, right? And because they realized, if you look at this geographically, there is no way to protect Japan and the Philippines if you give up the end of the Korean Peninsula and if you give up Taiwan, right? So afterwards, after the start of the Korean War, the U.S. just dropped this entirely, and this is still the case, right? That Korea is key to defending Japan and Taiwan as well. If you look at where Okinawa is, which is right here, and we have a major base there, and it is extremely close to Taiwan. So, and if you remember, in last year, so these are in August, the live fire military exercises that China conducted after Speaker Pelosi's visit. So here you see where PLA drones actually flew. This is Taiwan right here. And PLA drones flew over here. This is all Japanese territorial waters. These missiles that they fired over Taiwan, some of them, about 5 of them, landed in Japanese territorial waters as well. So there is no war over Taiwan that does not drag in Japan, right? And we are treaty allies with Japan. So this is, so giving up Taiwan is not as simple as it looks. So the question then is, why should we defend Taiwan? According to the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, taking Taiwan is a core interest, right? So it's super important to them. Is it important to us, right? And I think a liberal democratic Taiwan is also an essential interest for the United States. So I'm going to go through 5 different reasons. I think all these reasons hold simultaneously, and that's because I think it's overdetermined that the US should care about defending Taiwan if another country tries to encroach on it. So the first reason is, of course, the semiconductor market. Or more broadly even, defending the US's economic interests. So Taiwan is US's 9th largest trading partner. You compare it with Ukraine, which was the 67th largest trading partner of the US. And Taiwan dominates the global semiconductor market. So this is in 2021. TSMC and UMC, those are both Taiwanese companies, alone, they have 28% and 13% of global shares in matured nodes, so 40 nanometers and below. Now, in 2022, Taiwan had 48% of global 12-inch equivalent wafer foundry production capacity, and they had 66%, this is Taiwan right here, 66% of the global foundry revenue. Right, so they massively dominate this market. The global semiconductor shortage during the COVID pandemic, some of you guys may have experienced that. We needed chips in everything: banking, cards, credit cards, personal electronics, your cars, not to mention weaponry, right? So if Taiwan is invaded, the shortage will be orders of magnitude greater than what we experienced in the pandemic. And that's partly because, Taiwan, it does dominate the market overall, but for the most advanced semiconductors, actually 92% of those are made in Taiwan, right? The remaining 8% are made in Korea. So the very high end, Taiwan has a near monopoly. So the U.S. in last year, 2022, passed the CHIPS and Science Act, which invests in semiconductor R&D, and TSMC is now building a foundry in Arizona. But replacing Taiwan's semiconductor industry is much harder than it seems. There's an art to making microchips. It's not just science, and it also hinges on a broad global manufacturing network. So the U.S. is decades away from reducing its dependence on Taiwan in this respect. Okay. So the first reason that we should care is economics. Right. Second is our own security. So this is what we want to do is, in order to contain China, we have to keep this first island chain. So this is the first island chain, and this is the second island chain. This is how the military thinks when it looks at Asia, in terms of first, second, and third island chains. So in order to protect itself, and you see Japan right here is right at the first island chain, and South Korea is on the inside of it. In order to protect ourselves and our allies, we want to keep this island chain or maintain our influence. Taiwan is, of course, right at this nub. And it is, in many ways, you may have heard Taiwan referred to as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. So, so potentially it can offer a lot of support to U.S. allies in Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. Now, what happens if you give up this first island chain, or even the second island chain, and you allow China to push forward its rear operating bases? That means it can move forward its missiles. So the US is already at a disadvantage when they're operating in Asia, and that's because China's rear operating bases, say along here, they're only a few hundred miles away. Whereas the US's are way off. They're 6,000 miles away already. So giving up this island chain will put us at a further disadvantage. Right? So that's the second reason, is defending our own security. Third reason is defending US credibility. So this is the treaty that we have with Taiwan. It's the Taiwan Relations Act from 1979. And it says it's the policy of the US to that one, Taiwan's future should be determined by peaceful means. 2, the US will provide Taiwan with defensive arms. And 3, the US will maintain its own capacity to resist any coercive force over Taiwan. Now, Biden has said several times in the past few years, to great international consternation, that the US has a commitment to defend Taiwan, and it would honor that. And what is at stake here really is American international credibility. Right? Letting China gobble up Taiwan would upend the global order. This post-World War II global order. It would leave China as the region's uncontested power. And this matters. I mean, the US international reputation, credibility, perceptions of its strength, it has taken a hit since both the Trump administration and the Afghanistan withdrawal. We're looking a little stronger now with the resistance to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But that invasion happened in part because Russia thought that the US and NATO and the EU were too weak and they would not respond. So the US, if the US allows Taiwan to be taken by China, it cannot hope to retain its own prominent position in the global system. I think I said this yesterday to somebody. If the US is okay with becoming a country more like the UK or like France in the geopolitical pecking order, then sure. Right? The US does not have to care about its commitments to Taiwan. Right? But if the US isn't okay with that, if it wants to remain the global superpower, then it has to take its own credibility seriously. All right. The fourth reason is historically what counts as sovereignty. And I would argue that the US has a strong interest in defending the principle of sovereignty, which is again more firmly established in the post-World War II order. So bear with me for a little bit of Taiwan history here, because it'll all make sense when I get through it. So China claims that Taiwan is part of China. China actually does not have a strong historical claim to Taiwan's territory. Historically, there have been lots of different groups living in Taiwan. It's very ethnically diverse. First, there were lots of different Aboriginal tribes, and then you had waves of Han Chinese coming over from the mainland. mainland Asia, you had Western colonials who had trading posts there. So the Dutch were there, Portuguese and the Spanish, all of them were there briefly in the 17th century. None of these groups ever controlled all of Taiwan's island. So you can see where the Spanish were here, the Dutch were here, and oh no, maybe these were the Dutch. And so they occupied various parts of the island, but all this stuff in white was not occupied by colonials. So none of them ever controlled the whole island. They were eventually driven out by the Ming and the Qing dynasty. Now, Taiwan has historically been a sanctuary for opposition forces who were driven into exile from China. So Ming dynasty loyalists in the 17th century, they fled to Taiwan when they were defeated by the Manchus. In 1911, with the Xinhai Revolution and the establishment of the Republic of China in 1912, you had another wave of people coming over from 1945 to 1949. When the Kuomintang lost the Chinese Civil War, you get another wave of people. But it's important to remember that the Ming loyalists and the KMT, when they fled to Taiwan, they did not find unpopulated lands, and they also didn't find a welcoming population, right? They had to subjugate the people who were already living there, who already had their own societies and governments, and they did so very violently. Right. Now, going back a little bit in history, the Qing dynasty made Taiwan a province from 1683 to 1895, but it had difficulty governing Taiwan. There were lots of conflicts between the different groups of immigrants on the island. There was opposition from the Aborigines. There were repeated invasions by Western countries in the 19th century, including Britain, the US, and France, mostly as part of invading China. So back then, I mean, we can see that Taiwan's strategic value geographically was already evident. Now, also, the Qing also never controlled the entire island. So this map here is the extent of Qing control. You can see that really they only had about 2/5 of the island. They never took the mountains and anything on the eastern side. So the first group of people who actually conquered the whole island would be the Japanese, who held Taiwan as a colony from 1895 to 1945. And it took them 3 decades to finally subjugate the last Aborigines. So one of the questions when we say who has legitimate claim over a territory, right? History is one way that you can decide who legitimately claims a territory, and historically, China has a very weak claim over the territory. We can also look at legal agreements, the international law. So when China lost the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, it recognized the independence of Korea, and it ceded Taiwan to Japan as part of that settlement. So Japan surrenders in World War II in 1945. Taiwan is put under Chinese administration. But at this point in 1945, Chinese administration is the Republic of China. It's governed by the KMT. It is not the PRC, the People's Republic of China, governed by the CCP yet, right? Civil War is not over. So Civil War, KMT loses the Civil War in 49. It retreats to Taiwan. Now there are competing claims to both China and Taiwan from the PRC and the ROC. So things get more complicated. In 1952, there's the Treaty of San Francisco, which is a treaty between Japan and the Allied forces. And Japan formally renounces its claim to Taiwan. But the treaty does not specify what Taiwan's status is after that. Notably, China, the PRC, was not invited. They did not sign a treaty because there was dispute over whether the PRC or the ROC, so PRC over here, ROC here, which one represented China. Same year, there's the Treaty of Taipei, and this is between the Republic of China and Japan. So this treaty is just with the Republic of China, right, the KMT, who's retreated to Taiwan, and Article 10 of this treaty says that Taiwan belongs to the ROC. Now, there's some legal ambiguity here because at this point, Japan had already given up Taiwan, but it was unclear to whom it had given it up. So could this Treaty of Taipei actually adjudicate possession of Taiwan, or did it just end the war between Japan and the ROC? There's some legal ambiguity about that, all right? But as we've seen, the legal question is, it is not nearly as clear-cut as the Chinese claim. And second, the legal question is only one way of, it is one among several ways of adjudicating who has legitimate claim over territory. Like I said, historical claim matters, legal claims matter too. It's a little ambiguous here. But from the US perspective, why should they care about preserving this principle of sovereignty? And partly it's because the US has a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. It has an inherent interest in preserving the global order, this norm of state sovereignty and a norm of non-aggression. It has ramifications for everybody, including us, right? And so in order to maintain some stability in the international order, we should care about sovereignty. So, but like I said, the legal and historical claims only get you so far. With the post-World War II spread of the liberal democracy and the liberal global order, having a legitimate form of governance becomes very important. And this is the last reason I'm going to give you for why the US should care, which is defending liberal democracies, because liberal democracies are inherently worth defending. So countries where their governments represent their citizens, they allow basic sets of human rights, they practice rule of law, they have an independent judiciary, these societies tend to be need to be defended because they practice what we would consider a rightful, legitimate form of rule. But these forms of governance, as if you guys all read the news, so these forms of governance are difficult to sustain, right? And that is because they really are unnatural. So Taiwan, in this respect, where does Taiwan fall on this? It's materially and historically different from China in a way that strengthens its claim to independence and sovereignty. Taiwan's operated as an independent country for 70 years. It miraculously transformed from a dictatorship into a liberal democracy in 1987. Well, martial law was listed in 87, and then you got elections a little later. Since 1996, Taiwan's been a stable liberal democracy with 7 free and fair presidential elections, multiple peaceful transfers of power. This is a transformation from a one-party dictatorship to a stable liberal democracy that China has never had. All right, and its current political system has the resounding support of the people. Nobody there wants to be governed by China, right? Even those who would like a closer relationship with China. Taiwan identity has interestingly developed much more strongly over time. In August of 2021, there was a poll that showed a record 68% of Taiwanese public identified solely as Taiwanese, not as Chinese. And more than 95% wanted to maintain either de facto sovereignty or declare independence. So why should the US care about this? Liberal democracy is a universalistic value system. And I think it's the burden of universalistic theories to be held to a higher standard. All liberal democratic societies, not just the US, bear this burden. But why should we, the United States, bear a special burden? Well, every country thinks it's special, not just us, right? But lots of countries have constitutions that enshrine liberal democratic rights. They have free commercial enterprise, they have rule of law, they have diverse societies. What makes the US different from these other countries, right? What makes the US more special than Great Britain, than France, or Japan? So for example, as an example of how the US thinks it's special, it has signed but not ratified many significant international treaties, including the Geneva Conventions. There's these additional protocols 1 and 2, and those govern how you can and cannot fight in war, how you should be treated as a POW, all sorts of regulations in warfare. The US has not signed this, right? Now, the US often chooses to abide by these laws anyway, right? But it is entirely discretionary, and there's no legal obligation to do so. And there's also no enforcement, even if it wanted to, even if it did. Now, the US has not ratified these treaties because it very jealously protects its national sovereignty, in the same way that China jealously protects its national sovereignty. So why do we think that American exceptionalism is legitimate, but Chinese exceptionalism, for example, is not legitimate? And I would say the only thing that makes the US special is its history and its role in the world. So historically, the American Revolution was a different kind of revolution. It was imbued with universal values. It wasn't a parochial or particular revolution. But there have been other universally grounded revolutions. The big difference is they have not lasted in the same way as the American one. And I think everything that's interesting or special about the US flows from this, right? Those values and this history of continuity, they've led the US to wield global influence that, for the most part, is not through empire, right, but mostly through the spread of liberal ideology and governance. And that's it. That is everything that's special about this country. All right, so American exceptionalism, I think, can only be justified by its role in protecting and spreading liberal democracy. All right, part 3. So one question I often get is, what is China thinking when it looks at Russia's invasion of the Ukraine? How does this affect Taiwan? Is China more or less likely to invade Taiwan? So I think on net, the chances are about the same, but the considerations and weightings are being adjusted. So, oh wait, let's see. This is a comparison of the size of Ukraine with the size of Taiwan. And you can see the Ukraine is much, much larger, bigger population. So Ukraine has about 230,000 square miles, 43 million population. Taiwan has almost 14,000 square miles, population of 23 million. So these geographic differences are going to be really significant. Being a large country with land borders to several US and EU allies, Ukraine is added as very much an advantage. It's both easier to invade Ukraine, from the east, but it's also easier to supply Ukraine with weapons, right, as we have seen. But Taiwan is much smaller. It's also an island. And with one major island separated by a strait. So it will be harder for China to invade Taiwan, but it will also be harder for the Taiwanese to evacuate or to flee. So to date, as of September 2022, there were about 7 million refugees that had fled out of Ukraine. We would not see nearly that many coming out of Taiwan, right? How are they going to get off the island? So there would be many more civilian casualties in Taiwan than there would be Ukraine. So both the US and China would find it harder to move weapons and personnel in and out of Taiwan. Now, what might China be learning from the Russia-Ukraine war? First, they're learning about the US and allied response. So far, the US and allies, they've done much more than expected. It's not a guarantee of future action, but China has noted this, and it will, even as it continually tries to test the United States. They're also learning a lesson about military preparedness. Right? Putin expected a quick victory. He sent in an unprepared military that seemed to do little planning. They're performing far worse than expected. Right? China will know to be better prepared. And this is where the third lesson is that military experience matters. So the Russian military has not had serious military experience at this scale in the last 3 decades, and we can see that in its intelligence failures, its planning failures, its lack of preparation, lack of joint operations, just inadequate equipment. The fighting in Chechnya, Crimea, Georgia, and the Donbass, they were not adequate to prepare them for this task. But China's in a similar situation, right? It has not fought a war since 1979 against Vietnam, and this is well before the modernization of the military. So the Chinese military has undergone a lot of reforms in the past few years. They've reorganized their commands. They're trying to cut back on the number of conscripts, professionalize its military officers. But it's hard to know how thorough those reforms have been. They're not battle tested. And so the CCP itself, if it were being honest, would have no idea how its military will perform or how well their joint operations will work. Right. And this is an interesting comparison to the United States, because US over the past 2 decades, 3 decades, have had all sorts of military misadventures. They've been very unfortunate strategically, but in terms of military preparedness, they've given the US a lot of valuable combat experience, and that matters. Combat experience makes a difference. The other lesson which they should be learning, hopefully they're learning, is about civil-military relations in authoritarian regimes. So there's a growing tension in the People's Liberation Army between, there's a steady professionalization of the officer class and the military on one hand, but there's also simultaneously been a reimposition of ideological controls in recent years. So we're starting to see some tension there. There's a wrong lesson for the US to take from Russia in the Ukraine. The danger is that we will assume that the Chinese military, the PLAN, is just like the Russian military, that it is similarly corrupt, its reforms are similarly problematic. Maybe it is, right? But we don't know that. We simply don't know how well the PLAN was going to perform. But on the flip side of it, neither does Xi Jinping, all right? He, if he were being honest, would have no idea how they would perform, and that's because in any system, there are incentives to not be truthful to your superiors. This is the principal agent problem. You don't want to be truthful about the sorry state of affairs, and the incentives to lie about the state of your military are even stronger in authoritarian systems. Look at Russia. So hopefully this will give Xi Jinping some pause, because he has no idea if anything he's been told about his military is true. And if he suffers a humiliating loss over Taiwan, that would be the end of CCP's one-party rule. Now, what would happen if China tries to take Taiwan? Well, like I said, it's not going to be peaceful, it's not going to be pleasant. So if you've heard of the one country, two systems framework, it's always associated with Hong Kong, but that was actually originally conceived for Taiwan. And it is, of course, a lie, if you guys have been keeping up with what's happened in Hong Kong. So there will be resistance, and the question is, what would it take to pacify the Taiwan population? There have been some really interesting studies. So first of all, the PLA plans have focused on what we call decapitation strikes, which is basically trying to eliminate the government. Right? And this is something the Russians did as well. This is one of the reasons they made the drive to Kyiv, was they wanted to cut off the head of Ukraine by killing or capturing the president. So all of China's plans for Taiwan have historically focused on decapitation. And so the government presumably will be in Taipei up here. But given what they're seeing in the Ukraine, they're probably now developing more counterinsurgency plans. But counterinsurgency is, as the United States has discovered, much more difficult than it seems. And the number of people, the number of military personnel it takes per population to pacify them is enormous. All right, so China has they have the people, but it would take a lot of resources. So one other interesting thing is whether, most people assume that an invasion of Taiwan, taking Taiwan, is going to be basically the sudden, massive, full-scale invasion. It'll involve a lot of amphibious landings. And maybe that's what's going to happen, but it is enormously difficult. It will be enormously difficult to hold the island, right? First, there are all these mountains, and if, for those of you who have been to Taiwan, you will know that these mountains are incredibly difficult to traverse. This is one of the reasons it took the Japanese so long to pacify the Aborigines, right? Operating in these mountainous regions is very challenging. The other reason is this map over here. These are all the rivers in Taiwan. You can see Taiwan has lots of rivers. They're short, but very fast, right? And so this is going to cause, this will throw up a lot of operational roadblocks. So maybe they might succeed in invading Taiwan initially, but holding the population is going to be really challenging. And then there's a question of, then what does the US do, right? After that, say, after the first week. The other interesting thing to think about is, so like I said, everybody assumes that it's going to be this, this massive, full-scale amphibious invasion. I think that's actually kind of unlikely. So I think it's much more likely that that China will first try to seize some of these outlying islands. If you look, this right here is like where Jingmen is, across from Xiamen. This is like the DMZ in Korea, right? It's right across the border. There's the Matsu Islands up here. It'd be trivially easy for China to seize either of these. And the question is, what would we do about it, right? So that's a possibility. The other possibility would be to, you can try to seize the north and the south. This was actually a plan that the US had in World War II when we were still battling Japan. So we had plans to invade Taiwan and just take the north and the southern ends, which is where most of the population is. So that's something else that the Chinese may be thinking about. The third option would be the hardest, I think, for the United States to respond to, and that would be a blockade. Right, trivially easy for China to blockade Taiwan, and something like Taiwan imports about 60% of its food supplies. So, how long could the population survive? It's blockaded. But the tricky thing about the blockade is, technically, no shots are fired, right? And that makes it really difficult for the U.S. to say, I'm willing to go in and wield some force when the other side has technically not fired a shot. Right? This is part of what we call, gray zone operations, and they're very challenging for the U.S. We like things that are straightforwardly one or the other. Is it war? Is it not war? Right? And a blockade is kind of that in-between zone, and we don't know what to do with it. Last, I want to talk about timing and then the global economy. So when is this going to happen? When is the invasion of Taiwan going to happen? If you follow the news, it seems to be getting earlier and earlier. Every time some military general or admiral opens their mouth, they're just like, oh, first it was going to be 2027. Now the invasion is going to be 2025. Now it's 2024. So next year, you guys, is when it's going to happen. Both the US and China are engaged in efforts to decouple technologically from each other, but China is actually the more vulnerable one right now. So there was a report from Beijing University. They themselves criticized China. They said China lacks control over its core computing systems. It's far behind the US in terms of a number of important areas, including semiconductors, operating systems, and aerospace. But China's trying to change that. So its 14th five-year plan, this was established in 2021. It makes self-reliance in science and technology a cornerstone of its economic policy. And that includes everything from agriculture to vaccines, computer operating systems, payment networks, semiconductors, civilian aerospace. But extracting yourself from the global supply chain is much harder than it seems. So I'm going to give you a great example about the chicken industry. So developing a domestic chicken, poultry industry, it really shouldn't be that hard, right? But or so it seems, much of the global poultry market, however, is dominated by two firms. One is Aviagen. It's based in Alabama. It's owned by the EW Group in Germany. The other is Cobb, which is owned by Tyson, which is an American poultry giant. So they have pedigree birds that are the product of 80 years of selection for traits, for very specific traits, namely efficient food to meat conversion, rapid growth, strong leg bones, and disease resistance. So these birds are so valuable, they never leave their maximum security farms in the US and the UK, right? Their second generation offspring, they are flown to breeding sites that are dispersed in various countries, including Brazil and the UK and New Zealand, in part to hedge against supply shocks when you get avian flus or other diseases across borders. And then the third generation chicks, when they are 1 day old, they're air freighted to local partners, for example, to Jiangsu in China. And there, they will spend 6 months growing and being bred in a climate-controlled, artificially lit indoor facility. Right. So that's how you get your chickens. Right? You're getting the third generation and their offspring of all the chickens that you're eating. So in all, China imports 1.6 million third generation, what we call white feather chicks every single year. Now, why? There are lots of chickens in China. For those of you who have been there, you probably have seen them. They're running around. Why do they need these white feather chickens, right? They have local yellow feather chickens, which are apparently a lot tastier. I think they're much tastier. But they take twice as long to mature as the white feather ones. They only weigh half as much. And they're not nearly enough of them to meet local demand. The Chinese are trying to work on, trying to develop suitable local chickens for sufficient mass breeding, but this would take decades. All right. So this is a nice example of, something that shouldn't be so hard. But given how hard it is to become self-reliant in chickens, something that seems very basic, think about how much harder that would be for key industries like semiconductors. Right. So China has been trying to build its more competitive semiconductor manufacturing industry, but it's run into a lot of setbacks, and that's because the chip industry is enormously complex. Right? It draws on an integrated global supply chain and from expertise in different regions. So it needs design in the US, it needs manufacturing in Taiwan and South Korea, it needs assembly, packaging, testing in China, it needs equipment from the Netherlands. Right, so each region, all these different regions have comparative advantages that have been built with decades and decades of capital expenditure and research and development. So industry experts are estimating it could take 30 to 50 years for China to become an industry leader in semiconductors. So China is, for the time being, stuck in an embedded global economy, right? Would a unified global sanctions regime against Russia, like the one against Russia, work as well against China? Well, there are lots of different ways of looking at it. One is to look at foreign currency reserves. So compared to Russia's, had $640 billion in foreign currency reserves when they started their war. China has $3.2 trillion in foreign currency reserves. Right. And so you've probably heard the saying, if you owe the bank $1,000, you have a problem. But if you owe the bank $10 million, then the bank has a problem. Right? And the West collectively owes the Chinese state hundreds of trillions of dollars. And this is an enormous problem for China because the debtors can simply not pay when they are asked to. On the other hand, China is a much more important global supplier than Russia is. Right? Russia in 2019 was the US's 20th largest supplier in goods imports. China is the largest exporter of goods in the world since 2009. And in 2013, it is the largest trading nation in the world. That used to be the United States, but no longer. China is currently the US's largest goods trading partners, almost over $550 billion in two-way goods trade in 2020. The US imports a lot of agricultural products from China. China is our seventh largest supplier of agricultural imports. And there's enormous US foreign direct investment in China. So over 123 billion in the year 2020. And that's an increase, almost a 10% increase from 2019. So economic interconnectivity means more risk for everybody. But the danger is to assume that economic ties and economic trade would lead to a certain kind of government and could lead to peace, right? But this has shaped a lot of geopolitical strategies. If you look at the Germany's post-Cold War approach to both Russia and China, the US's approach to China, the German phrase for this is Wandel durch Handel, which is change through trade, right? That the assumption that economic opening would be followed by a political opening. And trade did change China, and they weren't wrong about that, but it didn't change it in the way we expected, right? Politically, it developed more like an autocracy and a surveillance state, and all the trade made it stronger, right? It made it capable of imposing a much stronger autocratic and surveillance state. So the idea of change through trade, it's not a dumb idea, but it is usually wrong. Right? And historically, economic interconnectivity is not enough to prevent war. Almost every war you can think of, all the major wars, World War II, for example, World War I, these were all between states and entities. They were deeply economically enmeshed. So, all right, I'm going to wrap up here in about 3 minutes. So how much global reordering, because I said this was the major problem, how much global reordering will China actually be able to do? And I'm going to look at this slightly in the context of the Russian invasion. So in the long run, I hope, that Russia comes out weaker from this war. But either way, whether Russia becomes weak or not, it's dangerous for the United States, right? Let me explain why. In recent years, China has become Russia's largest source of imports and the biggest destination for its exports. But there's a massive disparity between Russian and Chinese economic power. So 30 years ago, the Chinese economy was roughly the same size as Russia's. The Chinese economy is now 10 times as large as Russia's. So if there were to be some kind of neo-fascist alliance with Russia, Russia would be very much a junior partner. We've seen that China is unwilling to insulate Russia from the consequences of the Ukraine invasion, and probably doesn't want to. And that's because the US, for many reasons, but partly the US restricts the imports of sophisticated chips to China and Russia. And China, being more embedded in the global economy, it needs a lot of US products, right? And so US export controls on high-end products like semiconductors, they apply to any companies that globally use American software and technology to manufacture their products. That includes a lot of Chinese firms. So there are going to be limits to what China will be willing to do to help Russia evade sanctions, for example. Also, their economic hubs, geographically, I don't have a map of this, but their economic hubs are located very far from each other, right? Most of Russia's economic activity is west of the Ural Mountains. Most of China's economic activity is in the east. And the transportation infrastructure between Russia's west and China's east is not great. So that transportation is challenging. But I think the decline of Russia, will create more room for China in the Asia region. And that makes China more dangerous for the United States. Right. So all the more essential for the US to continue maintaining the global order in the future, even, I don't want to sound like a warmonger, but even if it requires a war. The US is historically and now, they're continuously ambivalent between interventionism and isolationism. And I've made the argument for why a certain kind of interventionism for the US is required. War would be incredibly expensive if it came to pass, but it would also be in the US's interests to go to war if necessary. And that's partly even for purely self-interested reasons. 80% of the world's oil is either found at sea or it moves to its final port by sea. 6% of the natural gas does that. So overall, 2/3 of the world's supply of oil and gas moves by sea. So this is just one example of how the world's economic system is deeply tied to the ocean. And the cost of losing this order, this freedom of navigation and the free global trade that comes with it, the cost for the United States, and the lives, the very comfortable lives that we all live, those costs would be enormous and much greater than that even of a major war. So that's it. Thank you very much. All right, questions? Yes.
I guess I need a microphone.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry. Hello? Oh, I turned it off. There was maybe.
You got it?
Yeah, there you
I want to go back to your description of the relative strength of the U.S. Navy and the Chinese Navy.
Yeah.
I think that was very deceptive because it's not where we are today that's important. It's where we're going to be. And I think you're aware of the Hudson Institute study that showed that the Chinese Navy would be 50% bigger than ours come 5 or 6 years down the road. It takes, from the time you plan to build a ship till the time it's commissioned, is close to 5 years. So for the next 5 years, it's very clear what the Chinese are building and what we're building. So I think we're at a terrible disadvantage there where it's going to be awful. Secondly, only about 20% of our ships can be stationed in the Asia, off the Asian waters. So the Chinese have total domination of the sea over there. Also, the missile strength from those shorter distances, no one's sure today if any naval craft will survive because missiles have much more accuracy now than they used to. And they're close to if we have any ships over there, they got a pretty good shot at sinking them. So I think when you just show a picture where the navies are about the same strength, that doesn't really portray the terrible disadvantage we're at. That's sort of a question.
Yeah, so I agree. Actually, the purpose of showing this is not to show that we are about the same strength. Already, the U.S. Navy is already the Chinese Navy is bigger than the U.S. one, and it is growing, whereas ours is shrinking. So I think that's actually that's a huge problem for us because we do rely too much on the high-end tech. We don't have enough infrastructure. We don't have enough hardware. So yeah, everything you're saying is in agreement with what I'm saying. The issue of the missiles, that is a big concern. I mean, one of the big concerns that the Navy has is, you have 6,000 people on board an aircraft carrier. You sink an aircraft, Chinese sink an aircraft carrier, you lose 6,000 people in one go, right? So this is a concentration of forces that that's really risky for us, right? And so one of the questions that the Navy should be asking is, how do we do force design, that reduces, what are the aircraft carriers doing for us? Can we do anything to reduce that kind of risk? And there are big concerns with the whole anti-access area denial zones, right? They basically, the missile defenses that the Chinese have. But the thing about these, anti-access area denial zones is that you can always punch a hole in them, right? You got to figure out how, but you can always punch a hole in those. And then once you do, then you got to sustain the hole. You have to get your ships and your crews in, to the right places. So, it's a literal arms race, right? But what we find in arms races is there's always some kind of response. We just have to figure out what it's going to be. So, great question. Yeah.
That's terrific, and you've touched a lot of points. But what about TikTok and the dominance of TikTok, the Chinese company, on personal, on military, on all kinds of propaganda, which they control? So I wonder how that will obviously affect the war on both sides, because they can deliver a message, edited, of course, to the Taiwanese as well. And in America, we don't seem to either, I don't think, made this case that you're making for going in and supporting either the details. So we're not too strong on this kind of propaganda, social media area. So could you comment really about TikTok and if it's relevant?
Yeah. So what's interesting is there are I think right now some ongoing congressional hearings about TikTok. The Department of Defense has recently banned the use of TikTok on, having TikTok on military service personnel's phones, right? So the question is, I guess the first question is, how dangerous is it? It's so legally speaking, the company that owns TikTok is actually separate from the Chinese company, which is ByteDance. I can't remember what the company that owns TikTok is actually called. But it does, what we have learned is that it will share information with the separate Chinese company, which is a concern. So should we, so I guess one of the questions is, how much should we care? TikTok itself is not yet a surveillance tool. It is a propaganda tool. It's not yet a surveillance tool. It could potentially be turned into kind of like these commercial ports that maybe could be flipped into for military purposes. TikTok could potentially be flipped for military purposes. Should we be concerned about that?
It's hearings today in the Congress
right.
on this subject.
Yeah. I think we should be concerned for government systems, government employees. So, for example, there are all these stories about, so not just in war games, but in actual war, there are all these accounts of Russian soldiers being targeted and killed because they're using their cell phones, right? These are major security risks. So for government personnel, including the military, probably should not have TikTok on their phones. For the rest of the population, I think that's a trickier question. And this actually, I think, goes to Vicki Johnston's question, right? So actually, do you want to read that question? I can do both at the same time.
I wanted to ask her, but she's not here. Your thoughts are, what are your thoughts on the, what are your, no wait a minute, let me hit. What are your thoughts on the 5th generation war, which the Chinese has suddenly, or not so subtly, been engaged in around the world through Belt and Road initiatives, infiltrating our schools, overtly or covertly stealing technology, and other means? TikTok is obviously part of this.
Yep.
And this is her question.
Okay.
And
Right.
if you couldn't understand me, I still have a clue.
Yeah. No. So these are. These are two really good questions. Like I said, for the federal government and federal employees and military service personnel, I think it's the right thing to do to ban it from their equipment. For the general population, I think it's much trickier, right? And that is because I think the short answer is we live in a free and open society, and there are always costs to those benefits, right? We could not have the the technological advances that we have without immigrants, without foreign companies, without all these things, but those always come with risks, right? And so the question is, how do you weigh the risks and the benefits? And I think in a liberal democratic society, for a liberal democratic society that wants to be very wealthy and to live, these comfortable lives, it involves taking on more risk, taking on more security risk, and that's just the cost of it, right? And so sometimes it's gonna, sometimes we will get bitten by it. There will be security breaches. There will be incidents, but that's part of the cost of all these enormous benefits. So again, if you want to give up those benefits, then we can have a much more closed society. We can ban all these things. We can restrict, various exercises of various liberties, but there's a cost to that. So yeah, so I think that's how I would weigh those. I think sorry.
The overriding issue at this time is what kind of military response the U.S. will have when and if China does make a strategic move on the island. Mm-hmm. And the problem in part is that American military people think like Americans. They don't think like the Chinese. Mm-hmm. Xi and the Chinese party sit across the strait from Taiwan, and they see freedom and democracy. And it is flies in the face of everything they represent, and is a constant danger in their minds to the security of their state and the thinking of the Chinese people therein. So they have pledged to take Taiwan. The question is how and when. And the United States, as usual, you point out, is ambivalent, but positive action seems necessary. And I would think at the Naval War College, it's an issue they wrestle with on an almost daily basis.
Yeah, so all we ever talk about now is China. So you almost can't talk about anything else at the Naval War College. Yeah, so there's some interesting points in there. One is, yes, Taiwan actually poses an existential threat. Its very existence poses an existential threat to China. China's line is, democracy, liberal democracy is not appropriate for the Chinese people, right? Taiwan is proof positive that that is wrong, right? That you have historically Chinese peoples of various types, right, who have, successfully imposed a liberal democracy. It's a little messy at times, but so is every liberal democracy, right? So that does pose an existential threat. What is the U.S. going to do about it? So the military will do what it is told, right? The real question is the political will, and so it's all good. It's going to depend entirely on what kind of administration we have, what particular person, and whether they'd be willing to defend China. But to the point of how the U.S. should respond, I think what the U.S. needs to do is this is part of the whole black and white thing, right? The U.S. likes it when it's war or it's peace, and everything in between we have difficulty dealing with. And so things like all the gray zone activities in the South China Sea with the building the islands and and arming them, we have no response for that. We don't know what to do because no shot has been fired. The U.S. could be, we have these freedom of navigation operations, and they are somewhat helpful, but it's not nearly enough. Right? So the U.S. should be thinking about a lot more its own gray zone activities without falling afoul of, liberal democratic principles. But the U.S. should be thinking about its own gray zone activities, and I think it's starting to do this. It should be thinking more about the diplomatic the diplomatic side of things, right? So the U.S. attitude towards Taiwan is always, you know, Taiwan doesn't need any, it doesn't need recognition, you know, official recognition from these countries, you know, they don't, so all these countries that have been switching their recognition to China, right? The US's response is, it doesn't matter, right? These are all insignificant countries. The only country that matters for Taiwan is the US, right? That's been their approach. This is deeply problematic because one, the US is ambivalent, and two, the US cannot win a war in Asia by itself, right? It will need those allies, and it needs allies that will want to not just assist the US, but be willing to make sacrifices to assist Taiwan. And so the US needs to do more to build those alliances on Taiwan's behalf. They need to do more to embed Taiwan in international institutions and trade agreements and all these things. That's what's going to save it. But we're starting, you know, there's a recent, you know, Honduras has said it wants to switch over, and the, you know, recognition from Taiwan to China, I think it was last week, and the US has, is trying, actually for the first time, is trying to stave that off, right? So I think there's certain elements in the State Department that are starting to wake up to this, but a lot more needs to be done. Yeah, thanks.
How do you feel about China making inroads into the United States? Buying property in the Midwest, developing farmlands?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think this is a similar problem to the TikTok one, which is that all of those, you know, so buying property, developing industries, all these things are actually, they're good for us. They're good for our economy. They're good for the innovation that occurs here. You know, that is how we've become as rich as we are, is, you know, through these,
Not
you know.
with antagonistic countries.
Yes, absolutely with antagonistic countries, yeah. So, you know, so there is a risk, and so certainly you want to look at, you have to increase your counter surveillance activities, right? So all, you know, I mean, we have a robust counter surveillance and, you know, counter spy efforts in the United States, and so I think it just means that those agencies and those people have to work that much harder to figure out, you know, which, who's doing the buying, what kinds of deals are they making, and a lot of them will be perfectly legitimate. You know, they will be done for entirely economic reasons and not for any kind of nefarious reasons. And so you want to be able to separate those out from the other ones. And it means more work for us. It's harder for us, right? But I think that is the price you pay for the open economy that we have, which is enormously beneficial. Yeah. So it's not an easy it's not an easy solution, I think. I recognize I recognize the appeal of saying, okay, let's ban this, let's shut it down, but I think that comes back to bite us in the long run. Yeah.
So I have a question. You talked a lot about semiconductors. Mm-hmm. So it used to be a very cyclical industry. Right now they're ubiquitous. They're everywhere, and it's not cyclical anymore. But when you talk about our dependence on Taiwan, I mean, actually, even all the AI chips that are being made by NVIDIA are manufactured in Taiwan. So how have we gotten ourselves into this situation? I mean, 10 years to bring everything to the United States? I think that's, you know, pretty scary.
Yeah, it will take long. It would take much longer than 10 years. I think, yeah, for the really high-end stuff, right? And that's, and those are the things we need to care most about. I mean, if China's 30 to 50 years from being an industry leader overall, I mean, we're looking at about the same amount of time for high-end manufacturing. So, you know, again, this is part of the globalized economy. The U.S. is trying to. I think the tricky part here is how do you actually try to localize an economy that is inherently global, right?
And what about our own Belt and Road program? Do we have anything like that? Is there any kind of strategy?
So we have broader trade agreements, you know, NAFTA, and you know.
Who's doing
So, no, I don't know. I mean, hopefully the State Department is thinking about this. You know, but a lot of these, a a lot of these things. So here's actually one of the major challenges for the United States, and for actually a lot of all these liberal democratic countries. In a country like China, the economic elites and the political elites spend a lot of time coordinating things, right? They have to. You know, the economic elites are subservient to the political ones. In a country like the United States, and again, this is why we are so rich, the economic elites do whatever they want, right? And so, and the government, for the most part, lets them. So they let them, go to China and build factories there. They let them go, but not just in China, everywhere. So,
Yeah, but maybe that's worked in the past, but maybe that's not going to work now.
So that's one of the questions, right? Is to what extent do you want there to be political intervention in free economic enterprise, right? And again, there will be some costs to it. You will have to eat some costs in terms of access to markets, access to talent and development. So maybe some of those costs are worth paying, right? But it won't be all of them. And so the trick is finding where that line is. Something with the R&D, with this CHIPS Act, that is the sign that the U.S. is trying very hard to develop a domestic semiconductor industry. It will work eventually, right? But it will take decades.
What is your sense of Japan's emerging commitment and capability to support Taiwan?
So I actually think, overall, I think this is a positive development. I've long thought that, Japan, like Germany, for all the historical problems, and I understand why they are historically the way they are, but they've done their penance. They're a transformed country. They are major partners and crucial partners, for the United States. And so, Japan's recent willingness to, sound a little more muscular in the Asia-Pacific region, I think it's a good thing for long-term stability there. There are questions about, whether there will be. I doubt it. Yeah, so constitutionally they are not permitted to. This is post World War II. They're not permitted to have an army, but they have self-defense forces, right? And so the self-defense forces are basically their military. They're just calling it self-defense forces. They're actually fairly capable, and so the question is, are they going to be willing to use them? This is the same thing with Germany, right? Germany also, for example, they did not want. It took them a long time to even send peacekeepers overseas because and it's a good thing. They were afraid of their own, of their own possibilities. Japan too, but I think Japan is emerging from that the same way Germany, slowly emerged from it a couple of decades ago, and I think that will actually, in the long run, create more stability. So, and it's good for us too. We need a robust partner and a robust military partner in the Asia Pacific. So, sorry, I was like, what do we? So sorry, she's got the mic.
Thank you for giving your time to this wonderful CADER group. I want to ask you, because our news reporters are very lack, what is the follow-up with the balloons that were shot down after traveling a week over our strategic military bases?
Okay, so the question was about the balloons and what's happened since then. So actually, the balloons are a really great example of what I was talking about, which is low-end tech being able to stymie and defeat high-end tech. Right? The balloons were brilliant. It turns out actually there were lots of balloons all the time. We didn't notice most of them for various reasons. So I think the follow-up. I mean, so far we're kind of back to status quo ante. If there's another balloon, we'll probably shoot it down again. Hopefully not with a Sidewinder missile. That was totally unnecessary. But I think it should, it's one of those things that the US government should be paying more attention to, right? That there are lots of other ways of collecting surveillance, of wielding influence, with the TikTok, for example. The government should be aware of that, should be thinking about it, and especially at the low end of the technology spectrum, right? The American way of pretty much everything, including war, is massive overkill, right? And I think these balloons, show that you don't have to have that. So, yeah.
Last night you mentioned that you give your courses at the War College, and that foreign students from any country can apply and are welcome to be part of your student body. Historically, and you're open and you tell everything that you can in your courses. Historically, have there been any foreign students to the War College that went back to their countries to be leadership in their countries?
I'm sure they have. I don't know specifically. I'm sure the War College keeps track because these are exactly the people that we would want to call when there's a crisis. I mean, this is what I learned, and that the countries develop formal diplomatic relationships with the time. We think they're very important, but whenever there's a crisis, what happens in the Pentagon? Everybody is running around going, "Who knows this person? Who knows this person?" And oh, I met him at the War College. I met him at some conference. Okay, I will call him. Right? Those relationships really matter when push comes to shove. There is, I understand, a lot of concern about letting foreign students in. The course sequence that I'm in, there is classified work going on at the War College. The course sequence that I teach in, and the only courses that the foreign students are allowed to take are those unclassified courses, right? So they're open to everybody. If you guys could get in, you could also take these courses. We're not hiding anything, so the value to us from both building those relationships and also trying to professionalize other militaries, right? This is something that yields a benefit that is less obvious to us, right? We want those militaries to be professional. We want them to be organized a certain way. We want them to abide by international rules of war, for example. So we want, so if some of these officers go back and they can influence their own militaries so that they commit fewer war crimes, that's a victory for us, right? So. But certainly in terms of building those personal relationships, they're very valuable to us, and that's one of the reasons we do it. Yeah. Yes?
I don't have the microphone, but based on what you were talking about, people buying farmland, buying buildings, in my experience, the more they buy, the more it's successful because no one wants to destroy their own wealth. And I have seen it, and I've worked with it. So I find it better that they buy in our country.
So it's a good point. So thanks.
So my question to you is, when they buy these boards or coerce the government to get in there with loans or whatever. Okay, so I looked at your map, which I really haven't studied before, and I think it's a good one. Are these boards sort of strategically planned?